Okay, so I'm delighted to be joined now by Elliot Swartz. He's Senior Principal Scientist of Cultivated Meat at the Good Food Institute. Elliot's been at the forefront of analysing what really drives costs in cultivated meat, from growth media and amino acid pricing to scale-up strategies and infrastructure designs. So with so much speculation flying around, his data-backed insights are helping reshape how we think about affordability and feasibility in this space. So Elliot, welcome to Protein Production Technology International.
Great to be here. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Nick.
Let's start by getting to know you a little bit better. I've seen you all over LinkedIn, but I don't really know anything about you. So before we dive into the nuts and bolts of cost modeling and amino acid pricing, tell us a little bit about your role at the Good Food Institute. What does your day to day look like?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm the principal scientist at GFI, leading our cultivated meat scientific work. And so, in a nutshell, that means I'm basically focused on trying to understand what are the technical and economic bottlenecks in the field, as well as identifying, some of the promising solutions to address them. And so, in terms of the work that we do, we conduct our own analyses. As you mentioned, I've done work on growth factors, on the cost, on the environmental impact of production. And we're currently working on, projects related to amino acids, the supply chain there, developing more robust techno-economic modeling approaches, and also lactate valorization from spent media. In addition to that, GFI through our research grants program, so we fund our own, we fund others to do research. So we try to identify, through our work, what are the areas that we think are most important, what are the gaps that need to be filled, and then we sort of, can prioritize funding for researchers to go out and start addressing those. And so, my day to day really is a lot of reading, a lot of writing, and a lot of talking to different scientists in the academic world or at companies.
And how did you end up not only at the Good Food Institute but working in the cultivated meat space? Was it science first, food first, or a bit of both?
Yeah, so I sort of, I was studying stem cell biology. So I'm really a stem cell biologist by training. In graduate school, I was learning more about, in climate change, environmental impact of meat production. And, about halfway through, that was when the first companies in the sector were founded. So Upside Foods, then Memphis Meats, raised money. I think at the end of 2015, there was a lot of press and attention, and I was just really sort of blown away and captivated by this concept of growing, meat from cells rather than, from animals. And so I had been following the industry at its onset, and I was really, sort of dead set on making that into my career, as it sort of married what I was doing, scientifically and my technical training with what I, ultimately cared about in the world, and in a way to have, maximize my impact on the field. And so I had the job lined up at GFI right after graduate school. I learned about GFI just through, as others do, if you start to Google alternative proteins or cultivated meat, you'll probably come across GFI's resources. It was a small organization back then, maybe, 25 people or so. But I've been there for the past 7 years now. Yeah, basically it's explicitly focused on cultivated meat. And yeah, we've grown to a team of over 120 or so in the United States. And then we have affiliate teams all over the world as well.
Mhm. Well, you're certainly highly respected for your work, and I know that you have a huge following on LinkedIn. So let's get into the juicy stuff, the media costs. Now that this has been a headline challenge for cultivated meat for quite a few years now, we often hear that the cost of growth media is the biggest barrier to affordability in cultivated meat. But from what you've been analysing, that might be an outdated narrative. Is that right?
So I think, when it comes to media, ultimately it's always going to be one of the cost drivers of production. Essentially the media is the feedstock of, the industry. That's what the cells consume. And like many other industries, whether it's conventional meat or it's fermentation, feedstock is a big cost driver. So it's really just about calibrating the media cost in a way that's going to fit the profile that's going to yield you a cost competitive end product for cultivated meat. The way to think about media costs, I think there's sort of it's twofold. It's how much do the raw materials actually cost themselves, so the amino acids, the glucose, salts, vitamins, etc. And then the other side is how efficiently are they used. And so, a lot of people you'll see they report media in this metric of dollars per liter, but this really only gives you a slight sense of the raw material costs, and that has to be taken into the context with what is the overall formulation, what is its nutritional density. So if a media formulation has 4 grams of amino acids per liter versus another that has 2 grams of amino acids per liter, well, the four gram per liter is probably going to be a higher cost, and so you have to have this context in order to make these comparisons.
Mhm.
And then the other important factor is, how efficiently it's used. And that really has more to do with the metabolism of the cells as well as the process itself.
Now, you mentioned in some of our preparation communications that existing models may have overestimated amino acid costs by 4 to 10 times. Now, that's quite a huge gap. What do you think's behind that discrepancy? Are we just looking at old assumptions, or maybe something more structural?
Right. Yeah. So, I mentioned we've started to do some work on trying to better understand the amino acid supply chain, how it's structured, what are people currently, how are they sourcing amino acids, what are the costs, et cetera. Because amino acids, based on previous models, have been identified as this, sort of sub driver of cost within the broader bucket of cell culture media. So past models have estimated the cost of amino acids in the range of, let's say, like $50 to $150 per kilogram. And but we've spoken to, now at this point, many of the world's leading cell culture media companies, amino acid suppliers that are actually manufacturing the stuff, the cultivated meat companies that are the end users. We've received real pricing quotes at scales that are, in the kilogram scale. These are not in like tens of thousands of tons scale that are not accessible today. And after all of that, we feel pretty confident knowing that the cost range today for most amino acids is more in the range of like $10 to $50 per kilogram, and so that's a pretty large discrepancy between what is actually currently available compared to what models have previously predicted. So in terms of what is behind all of that, simply put, it's just that prior models benchmark to farmer grade prices. And there's an existing supply of food grade media inputs, whether it's amino acids or glucose or other things that could be tapped into for significantly lower costs. And these are what's being used today.
Mhm. No, I often read that the targets are now below 10 cents a litre for media costs, and I think Believer Meats has hit 63 cents or there or thereabouts. How close are we really to seeing those sub 10-cent media costs in commercial production, do you think?
Yeah, you're right. So Believer Meats to date, has published the lowest media costs in their paper that was published last year is around 63 cents per liter. And actually just this week, Meatly and Gourmet, they actually both put out information that place their costs around 20 cents per liter. And I've spoken to others in the sector that are putting costs around, similar sort of range, in the 20 cents, 10 cents per liter range. So, right now, currently, it's difficult for me to say exactly where things are at. There's only so much published information that, can be independently verified. I think what we can confidently say is that, the raw material costs for media are lower than what previous models have assumed, as we just, were talking about, and that, these costs are likely to drop at larger scales of production in the future. So once you start hitting the tons, tens of thousands of tons of, cultivated meat volumes, then you're going to be able to maybe tap into those next pricing tiers with respect to raw materials. But, going back, as I mentioned previously, that's really just one piece of the needed information to really get a sense of the broader media costs. So we also need to know about, the nutritional density, of the media and also the feed conversion ratio in real processes.
Mhm. And for those people, I mean, you're a stem cell biologist, but for those people less familiar with this part of the process, why is feed conversion and understanding media usage so key to getting the full picture on costs?
Yeah, I think this is, sometimes missing from the conversation of how important this is. But, it's really simple to think about it. It's basically how much do you need to put in order to get a given quantity out. And so it really governs how much material you're going to need to make your end product. So, if you need two or three times as much inputs, amino acids and glucose and other things, well, your media is just ultimately going to be cost higher than something that's more efficiently used. And so, feed conversion ratio is a really important metric, but it's one metric that we don't have a lot of like real experimental data thus far to go off of. And so, a lot of that is based on modeling work. But I think companies conducting these experiments internally have these data. It's just that not a lot of it's published to date.
Mhm. Let's move on to the scale up story, which seems to also be getting a lot of airtime lately. Why do you think the narrative around scaling cultivated meat has become so negative? Are people overlooking the role of regulatory timelines or other challenges that might exist?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I think, what I see online with respect to scale up is that it seems like people like to tell this story that companies have struggled to scale up. But, my argument would really be that they haven't really even been given the chance. And so, it doesn't make sense to run an operation at any large scale if you have no product to sell on the other side of it. And so, you need regulatory approval to sell the product. And so right now, I would say that regulatory approval is really a primary limiting factor to knowing more about how successful scale up is going to be in this sector. And we know that there are, at this point, dozens of companies waiting in line for regulatory approval at different regions around the world.
Mhm. In our prep call, you actually brought up a great example with Val, Australia's Val. They've scaled recently, I think, to 20,000 litres post approval. Is that a blueprint that other companies can follow once that green light comes in?
Yeah, Val, I think is, right now the best case study that likely foreshadows where things are likely to go. Again, once companies get this approval that, they're ready to go to the market. They've scaled remarkably fast. They've gone from 0 to 20,000 liters in 6 years with, I think under, just short of $60 million raised. So that's already on par with, some of the larger biopharmaceutical processes that are going on around the world. But we also need to, I think, have them operating at longer timescales to really understand if there are any issues that they're going to run into. So one of the things that gets brought up a lot is, can you run these cultivated beet operations, over long periods of time with limited contamination in these sort of less, controlled environments in terms of like the actual facility floor. So moving again away from this pharmaceutical grade clean rooms and into something that looks more like conventional food production or a brewery type of environment. That to date has been, somewhat untested, and there's a lot of people that believe that it would be more challenging than what some people in the cultivated meat are saying. But thus far, it seems like that's the trend in terms of where things are going. People are saying we don't need these clean rooms; we can operate successfully in these environments, and I think we just need a little bit more, data and proof points there to bring that, into a better understanding. With respect to scale up in general, I would say there's still, different schools of thought that you hear about when it comes to this debate around scale up versus scale out, right? Um, and a lot of that ultimately is going to be dependent on the type of bioreactor you're using, the type of process that you're operating, whether it's continuous or batch processes, whether and what the product actually is on the other side, and whether it's a structured product, unstructured, the price range of the product, all of that like dictate aspects of how you're planning to scale. I think in terms of what most companies are likely to do once they get regulatory approval, I think in the short term, we're going to see scales targeted between like 5 and 40,000 liters. And that's going to enable, many, many tons of cultivated meat to be produced. And once we see multiple companies operating at this scale, hopefully in the next 2, 3 years, I think that's going to be a really important signal that, effectively sort of downgrades the risk profile of the entire cultivated meat sector.
Yeah, I agree with that. Do you think the industry's broader conversation about scale needs to shift from why aren't we there yet to what's enabling companies to finally get there?
Yeah, I mean, this is certainly the perspective that I take. Thinking about what is it going to actually take to get to where we need to go. When you think about scaling, I think successful scaling is really this sort of nexus of innovation and success that you need to have with respect to your cell line development, your media development, and your bioprocess development. And you really need to have all three of those, working together in order to be successful. But frankly, it's hard to do it all as a vertically integrated company under one roof. And so I think more and more that, the foundational knowledge that is being generated in the academic world and these B2B specialist companies that might, specialize in media formulation development or cell line optimization, those are going to be really important pieces to sort of drive things forward across the field. Those are that's the enabling piece of the puzzle that is starting to get more and more incorporated into real world processes.
Mhm. Now, equipment cost, that's often a massive capital hurdle, but you've been tracking some interesting innovations here too, I think. Val reportedly slashed 80%, I think, off bioreactor costs by designing their own control software and stripping down the system, which is pretty radical. Do you think more cultivated meat companies will go down that sort of do-it-yourself route, as it were?
Yeah, this is something we're trying to understand. So, we've put a lot of time thus far into more the upstream side of things, so the cell lines and the media. But as you mentioned, another important piece of this overall puzzle with respect to costs is the equipment and the infrastructure. And so we're starting to learn more about, the strategies that companies are using to reduce their equipment costs. And certainly one of those is by, designing your own vessel and then going out to fabricators that are outside of the biopharmaceutical sector to, obtain pricing that is at, much lower cost. And then also, doing your own installation, because installation is also a major piece of the cost for new equipment coming into the facility. You know, it, in all, I think like our understanding here is, I would say, in its infancy, but we're working to gather more information from different companies in the field to sort of put together a summary report that would shine more
Mm.
light on this.
Yeah, I was going to say, have you heard any similar things from others in the space? Is it a trend that's developing? Are they getting savvier about building fit for purpose infrastructure rather than relying on, as you said before, expensive pharma grade gear?
Yeah, in the conversations that we've had, I think a lot of people say, similar things with respect to the overall strategy. A big piece of that is I think going to fabricators that can, make vessels for other industries. And we're saying we don't need this pharmaceutical pricing or all of this sort of, quote unquote bells and whistles that might be attached. We can strip down the design and move to a sort of cheaper, more affordable method of production for cultivated meat equipment. And so yeah, I think that's definitely a trend that we are seeing. But there's other pieces of the puzzle too with respect to bioprocess, like media recycling and other things. And so yeah, we're still learning about that as we go.
Hmm. What do you think it would take to normalize that kind of lean engineering? Is it a mindset shift, sorry, or is it access to better talent and tools?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of people in the cultivated meat industry have this mindset already. I think they know that you can't really cost effectively manufacture cells in a pharmaceutical paradigm. And so I think what we need really is like more case studies and more real world data. So, you know, we know now that people can get quotes for pretty low cost equipment that's been stripped down, from a design standpoint, but, does the equipment work? Does it work in a real operation? I think we have less information about that. We mentioned before Meatly put out this, press release earlier this week, actually, their 320-liter bioreactor, the total install cost was like $15,000, which is just extremely low.
Mm.
So the question I have is, how well does that work in a real world environment? What makes it difficult, obviously, is that presumably a lot of time and resources get put into designing these vessels and doing the innovative work. Therefore, it's wrapped up in either trade secrets or might eventually come to light in patents. But what that means is that it's going to take us, I think, a while to really get an understanding of how well these things are working in the real world, what challenges we're run into, et cetera. That's part of our job, my job, to try to uncover that and shine a little bit of light into that. But I think once you get enough of these demonstrations in the real world, that starts to change and shift the belief into like, yeah, this can really be done as we've been saying it could be done, rather than it being, at this point in time, perhaps a little theoretical still.
Hmm. Let's widen the lens a little bit, Elliot, because everything we've talked about adds up to a much bigger picture of how we think about cost models in cultivated meat. If media costs are dropping, equipment's getting cheaper, and scale is finally achievable post approval, do you think we're on the verge of a serious recalibration of the whole cost narrative in cultivated meat?
I would say that, it's fair to say many companies in this sector are probably ahead of what the current narrative is for, what the critics and skeptics have been saying basically over the last 2, 3, 4 years, since some of these initial models came out that were, fairly conclusive in, saying that, this can't be done as effectively from a cost perspective. But, I only know that because I can talk to a lot of different people. I'm pretty steeped into the technical landscape. And so in terms of like that broader narrative shift, the timing of that, I don't think you get, this more mainstream recalibration until we have more products on the market. We need to know, how well received are those products? Do people actually like them? Do they taste good? That's going to be obviously crucially important. And then, as I mentioned before, more companies operating at scale for many months. And so, talking in the 10,000 liters of scale, producing tons of cultivated meat. I think that is going to be the signal, at least that I'm looking for, that I think will get more people into believing like, maybe this is for real.
You touched at the start a little bit on the role that GFI plays, but are you able to go into more detail about what the Good Food Institute does in making sure that these updated insights filter through to investors, policymakers, even the startups who may still be operating on outdated assumptions?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we're a team of like 120 in the United States, and then we have affiliate organizations in Brazil, in Europe, in Israel, India, Asia Pacific region, and Japan now, their new office that was opened last year. And I'm on the science and technology team, and so I just do one slight piece of the work that GFI does as a whole. We have other teams that do more policy focused work, trying to drive investment into public R&D as well as infrastructure funding from governments, as well as corporate engagement that works with educating companies outside of the alternative protein industry, teaching them about the opportunities, challenges, etc., the investor community. So yeah, we do a lot across the spectrum of these audiences, and I think we do have this sort of influential voice in terms of communication, and I do think that is a large piece of our role as being able to sort of take in what we can get from our network and the people that we talk to, and be able to effectively communicate the status of cultivated meat and other alternative protein technologies to all of these different audiences. We put quite a bit of work into thinking about communications. We have an entire communications department. And on the scientific side, at least, I think, typically scientists write these technical papers for other scientists to evaluate. And, it gets lost, I think, or overlooked at how important it is to be able to, you know, tailor that communication to these different stakeholder groups. Your work is not like pencils down once you get your paper published. I would say that's only half of the work. The other half is then going out and communicating it, making sure people understand it, because certainly the general public is not reading your papers in Nature Food. You need to sort of do additional work in order to, get that message out there. And, so of course we try to fill that gap, because a lot of the bandwidth at companies is just, only so much of that they can do. But, at the end of the day, we are trying to figure out how to make this work. Just like all the other companies and researchers in the sector. And obviously I want cultivated meat to work. But, I also need to be an objective scientist. And so I hope by now, GFI, myself included, have sort of built a reputation of, acting in good faith as this trusted voice in the sector, because, ultimately we need that trust in order to gain access to the information and the data that's typically, locked behind closed doors. And then we can get that information out there. It can sort of inform the work that we do and, give us this unique perspective and understanding of what's happening that we can then communicate.
I guess that job, depending on where you are in the world, is easier or harder. Perhaps in Japan and APAC, it might be a little bit easier to disseminate that information. But in America, with your new administration, it's a little bit trickier.
Yes, it just goes back to, tailoring the message, to these different audiences. Ultimately, hopefully alternative proteins is, a nonpartisan type of activity. But of course, people try to wrap it up in all different sorts of, perspectives along a spectrum. And so at the end of the day, I think it's just about tailoring your messaging from, let's say, talking about climate change to more talking about national security and resilience and that sort of thing. And so, but yes, it's important to understand the audience in all of these different regions around the world.
Now, I'm presuming that you've tried cultivated products.
I have gotten a chance when I was in Singapore a few years back. I tried a good meat product and a prototype from another company. Yeah.
And what was it like?
It was, it's pretty interesting. When I started at GFI, I went vegetarian full time because I felt like I needed to walk the walk if I was going to be talking the talk. And so, not eating a lot of meat nowadays, but obviously, I grew up eating meat, so I know what it tastes like. And I think what's really unique about cultivated meat, and you hear this anecdotally to basically anyone who's tasted it, but your brain is just wired to recognize the aroma and the taste of meat. And you instantly get that with cultivated meat in a way that you don't with other alternative protein products. And so, the good meat that I had was they had it on a little skewer back then. And that was like more of a structured, textured product where I think they might take, do some layering of the cells to provide that sort of three-dimensional structure. And so that had this sort of bite and the chewiness as well that you would expect from chicken, basically indistinguishable from the real thing. I haven't tried a lot of other products since then, but I was impressed. I'm looking forward to eating it when it's more widely available. And yeah, a lot of people say the same thing.
And you've been working in this field, analyzing this field for about 7 years now, I think you said. How do you think the industry will evolve, and how has that impression changed since you first came into this industry 7 years ago?
In terms of its evolution, I mean, I think things went really fast, right? There was a lot of initial hype. There was a lot of initial investment, and like any other technology, I think we're, in this hype cycle phase with respect to technology development, maybe a little bit in this trough of disillusionment right now. In some of the talks that I give, I often reference something called Amara's law, which is essentially that, for any new technology, you tend to overestimate its impact in the short term, but underestimate its impact in the long term. And I think, we're starting to, begin to turn that tide with respect to cultivated meat, where you start to get on this slope of enlightenment. But I think a lot of that slope is sort of dependent on what we talked about before with respect to regulatory approval, getting some semblance of scale. That's when things start to get this positive feedback loop in terms of excitement from the community again, from the public again, from the investors. More money comes in. Then you just continually de-risk in these innovation cycles across the field. And so that's ongoing right now. I think in terms of like my personal expectations, I always thought that this is going to be a very long-term endeavor that, is effectively getting in early on something that I will spend my entire career doing in order to make work. I think that timeline's generally still true. It's just I sort of view my work as trying to accelerate that timeline. So I think that, with respect to cultivated meats, Pandora's box has kind of been opened from a scientific perspective, a biology perspective. We know how to grow cells. We know how to make them into muscle and fat. It's really an engineering challenge. And as we've talked about in this discussion, a lot of progress has already been made in a relatively short amount of time, in 10 years or so, especially on cell lines, on media costs, et cetera. I think the next 10 years is going to be about scale up. So what's going to happen with scale? How low of a cost can we get with respect to some of this equipment that goes into it? How much do real manufacturing facilities cost? The estimates are all over the place. So we need to get a better sense of that, and then that will, I think, begin to paint a better picture of how cultivated meat will begin to emerge, and potentially begin to actually take market share, or grow in market share, at least with respect to conventional meat over the next 2 decades.
And of course, it might actually take the conventional meat sector to spur it on. I mean, do you see cultivated meat companies today just becoming parts of the meat value chain, just providing a cultivated product into their conventional meat value chain, or do you see one of those companies becoming a beyond or an impossible of the cultivated meat sector?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a lot of people nowadays are taking that viewpoint where they're going out to the conventional suppliers, food companies, meat companies, etc., and they're saying, can you license our technology, or can you build a facility for us, and where we provide the inputs, etc. So I mean, I think that strategy is definitely going to be a piece of the puzzle that many companies end up taking. And I also think it's possible that, we'll see a whole different array of options. I think some companies can, build a brand name products in-house. It's harder to do that, especially in food. But, some of that might be possible. And certainly some companies are trying to do that. The other thing I was going to say, I lost my train of thought. Oh, right. I think, right now that's sort of, with respect to like the involvement of the conventional meat industry, I think a lot of that is driven a little bit by, the investor landscape drying up a bit, and, who's going to fund these facilities? Well, it's maybe well-capitalized companies in the food system. But, again, if you have this narrative shift where, maybe some more information comes out in the next 2 or 3 years with successful operation at scale, that might bring in a new set of investors that view cultivated meat as de-risked. It views it as a more investable asset class that, that could change the strategy that companies have with respect to, financing these large scale infrastructure projects.
Before we wrap, Elliot, just a quick one to close us out and bringing us back to our topic about cost. If you had to give one message to cultivated meat community, startups, regulators, funders, about what's actually going to move the needle on cost, what would that be?
So, from my perspective, at least, I think one of the most important things that can be done, should be done, et cetera, is just building the knowledge of a foundation and being able to share publicly and openly what has worked and what hasn't. So, as we've talked about, I'm sort of in this privileged position because I know a lot of sensitive information through my conversations that could probably potentially help a lot of other people, but I'm limited in what I can share. Like I often say, like, if I could just, put together this transformer of technologies that have been invented in all these different silos and put them all together, like maybe we have the solution today already with respect to cultivated meat. And so, I really would encourage companies to follow in the footsteps of companies like Believer Meats, like Mosa Meat, some others that they've published their findings openly, have had a huge impact, I think, on how people view what's possible in the sector. And so I think more of that is really needed. That can really help accelerate the pace of innovation, and the overall success of cultivated meat, because I certainly view this as, hugely potential opportunity, one of the most transformational technologies that we'll probably see in our lifetimes. But we can accelerate that timeline with more information sharing.
We could probably spend another 40 minutes on collaboration, but we haven't got time. Elliot, it's been really lovely talking with you. I've probably read more of your work on LinkedIn than I have anyone else, so it's really nice to put a mouth to the face that I see on LinkedIn. It's really been great talking to you.
Yeah, thanks again for having me.
No problem. See you soon.